2:15 in the morning, the Strait of Hormuz. The B-52 Stratofortress, callsign Havoc 11, was maintaining a steady course at 35,000 feet when its electronic warfare suite detected a lethal change in the environment. This was no longer a show of force or a freedom of navigation flight. An Iranian HQ-9 battery near Bandar Abbas had transitioned from search to terminal fire control. 5 crew members sat in the darkness of the cockpit, knowing that a 3-ton missile was currently climbing toward them at 4 times the speed of sound. The night air outside the pressurized hull was 50 degrees below zero, a silent and indifferent witness to the sudden violence about to unfold. The scent of ozone and the hum of 8 engines were the only constants until the first defensive flares ignited the sky. Havoc 11 was part of a 2-ship formation operating 60 miles off the Iranian coast, providing a long-range maritime strike capability that the Department of Defense considered essential for regional deterrence. The aircraft, a veteran of the fleet, built decades ago but modernized with the latest digital glass cockpit and advanced jamming pods, was heavy with fuel and simulated ordnance. In the back of the aircraft, the electronic warfare officer watched his screen as a solid red diamond appeared, indicating a missile was in the air and actively homing on their position. He immediately deployed bundles of chaff and commanded the jammer to flood the enemy's radar frequency with high-powered noise. But the HQ-9 was a sophisticated, multi-frequency interceptor designed to burn through such defenses. In the cockpit, the pilot and co-pilot felt the massive airframe shudder as they banked the bomber into a desperate, high-G descending turn. A B-52 is not a fighter jet. It is a giant of steel and aluminum with a wingspan of 185 feet, and it does not move quickly. The pilot's hands were tight on the yoke, his eyes locked on the altitude indicator as they plummeted toward the black water of the Gulf, hoping the thicker air at lower altitudes would give them more room to maneuver or that the missile would lose its track in the clutter of the sea surface. 30 miles to the west, the crew of the second B-52 watched, the sensors in horror. They saw the thermal bloom of the Iranian missile as it cleared the coast, a white-hot spike of energy accelerating vertically. The Iranian operators had waited for the perfect window, firing when the American bombers were at the apex of their patrol track, furthest from the protective umbrella of carrier-based escort fighters. The engagement was calculated, professional, and devastatingly efficient. The Iranian missile covered the distance. At 30,000 feet, the proximity fuse on the warhead triggered. The explosion did not vaporize the bomber instantly, but it sent a cloud of heavy tungsten shrapnel tearing through the tail section and the portside engines. The number 5 and number 6 engines erupted in a fireball that bleached the sky white for miles. The shockwave slammed into the fuselage, snapping the primary spar and sending the aircraft into a violent, uncontrollable roll to the left. Inside the cabin, the chaos was absolute. The cockpit was filled with the scream of depressurization and the blinding glare of a 100-master caution lights. The pilot fought the controls, but the flight cables had been severed by the blast. He shouted the command over the internal comms for the crew to eject. In a B-52, the ejection sequence is a complex choreography of survival. The 2 navigators on the lower deck are fired downward, while the pilot, co-pilot, and electronic warfare officer are launched upward into the freezing night. One by one, 5 explosive charges detonated, punching the crew members out of the dying aircraft. They were thrust into a wall of 250-knot wind, their bodies subjected to massive physical forces as the parachutes deployed automatically. Below them, the remains of Havoc 11, once a symbol of American strategic might, broke into 3 large flaming pieces. The wings folded back like a wounded bird before the fuselage, slammed into the Persian Gulf with a force that sent a plume of water and burning jet fuel 100 feet into the air. Within minutes, the only sound remaining over the crash site was the whistle of the wind and the faint, rhythmic beeping of 5 emergency locator transmitters. The crew members were scattered across 4 miles of open water, drifting in their life vests in a sea that was 70 degrees, surrounded by darkness and the knowledge that the Iranian Navy was less than 30 miles away. At the Combined Air Operations Center in Qatar, the radar track for Havoc 11 simply vanished, replaced by a flashing yellow icon. The war that everyone had feared was no longer a theoretical exercise. It had begun with a flash of light and 5 missing Americans. 2:22 in the morning. The Combined Air Operations Center at Al Udeid Air Base, Qatar. Inside the windowless, reinforced concrete facility, the blue light of 100 high-resolution displays illuminated the faces of 60 personnel who had just witnessed a catastrophe. The senior air officer stood at the center of the room, his eyes fixed on the empty space where Havoc 11 had been tracking only 7 minutes prior. The air in the room was cold, kept at exactly 68 degrees to protect the massive server arrays, and it smelled of stale coffee and the ionized scent of high-powered electronics. A heavy silence had fallen over the floor, broken only by the rapid, rhythmic tapping of keyboards, as intelligence officers worked to confirm what the radar already knew. The technician at the search and rescue console was the first to speak, her voice steady despite the adrenaline. She reported that the search and rescue satellite aided tracking system had locked onto 5 distinct emergency locator transmitter signals. The beacons were originating from a cluster approximately 40 miles southwest of Bandar Abbas, drifting slowly to the southeast with the prevailing current. The coordinates were logged at 26 degrees 42 minutes north, 55 degrees 18 minutes east. This was deep inside the Iranian search and rescue region, but well within the reach of American assets if they moved within the next 60 minutes. Intelligence officers quickly cross-referenced the launch signature with satellite imagery and electronic signals intelligence gathered over the last 48 hours. They identified the culprit as a mobile HQ-9 surface-to-air missile battery that had been moved into a concealed position near the coastal cliffs of the Strait of Hormuz. The battery had utilized a brief window of radar emission to guide the missile before going dark again, a classic shoot-and-scoot tactic designed to avoid immediate American retaliation. The analysts estimated the battery was now relocating to a secondary hardened shelter, less than 10 kilometers from its original firing position. The commanding officer of the 7th Fleet, communicating via a secure satellite link from his headquarters in Japan, issued the order to activate the Combat Search and Rescue Protocol. The mission was designated Operation Crimson Vigil. The objective was clear and absolute: recovery of the 5 crew members of Havoc 11 before they could be captured by Iranian maritime forces. Intelligence indicated that 3 Iranian fast attack craft had already departed from the naval base at Bandar Abbas and were currently maintaining a speed of 40 knots on an intercept course toward the beacon locations. Every second was a calculation of distance and speed. To provide the necessary cover for the rescue helicopters, the Air Operations Center began retasking every available air asset in the Persian Gulf. 4 FA-18 Gulf Growlers from the Electronic Attack Squadron aboard the USS Abraham Lincoln were ordered to launch immediately to provide a continuous jamming blanket over the coast. Simultaneously, 2 flights of F-35 Bravo stealth fighters, already airborne on a routine patrol near the United Arab Emirates, were diverted toward the crash site to establish a combat air patrol. The tension in the command center was a physical weight. The staff knew that the survival of the 5 men in the water depended on a complex machine of logistics and firepower that was now spinning into motion. Orders were flashed to the MH-60 Sierra helicopters of the Sea Knights Squadron, which were already being brought up from the hangar decks of the amphibious assault ships. The pilots were briefed on the fly, their digital moving maps updated with the last known positions of the ejection seats and the estimated locations of the approaching Iranian vessels. The logistics of the operation were massive. To sustain the air cover, 3 KC-135 Stratotankers were launched from Al Udeid to establish a refueling track at 20,000 feet, just outside the range of Iranian shore-based missiles. This would allow the fighters to stay on station for hours if necessary, providing a shield of steel between the downed crew and the Iranian mainland. The mission was no longer about deterrence. It was a race against time and a test of the American military's ability to project power into a denied environment. As the sun began to edge toward the horizon far to the east, the first pair of rescue helicopters lifted off from the deck of the USS Abraham Lincoln. The crews were silent, focused on the mission ahead, their night vision goggles painting the world in shades of ghostly green. Below them, the Persian Gulf was a vast, dark expanse that hid both their comrades and their enemies. The command center watched the blue icons crawl across the digital map, each one representing dozens of lives and billions of dollars in technology, all converging on a single point in the water where 5 Americans were waiting for a miracle. 2:45 in the morning. The flight deck of the USS Abraham Lincoln. The aircraft carrier was steaming into a stiff 30-knot headwind, its massive hull cutting through the dark swells of the central Persian Gulf. On the 4.5-acre flight deck, the usual rhythmic hum of night operations had been replaced by a frantic, high-stakes urgency. 2 MH-60 Sierra helicopters, belonging to the Sea Knights of Helicopter Sea Combat Squadron 22, were being pulled into position on the number 3 and 4 catapults. Their rotors were already spinning, the tips blurring into a ghostly gray halo under the dim red floodlights of the deck. This was not a drill. 5 American lives were currently drifting in hostile waters, and the clock was aboard the enemy's greatest ally. The air on the flight deck was a thick, biting mixture of salt spray and the heavy, acrid stench of JP-5 jet fuel. In the cockpit of the lead helicopter, callsign Rescue 1, the pilot adjusted his night vision goggles, the world turning into a grainy, emerald-hued landscape. Beside him, the co-pilot was finishing the final weight and balance calculations for the 4 pararescue jumpers sitting in the cabin behind them. These men, elite specialists trained for the most dangerous recoveries on the planet, were checking their gear in silence. They carried waterproof medical kits, high-gain satellite radios, and M4 carbines fitted with suppressors and infrared lasers. Every piece of equipment had been checked twice in the last 10 minutes. The launch sequence was a masterpiece of United States Navy precision. At 2:52 in the morning, the yellow-shirted flight deck directors gave the signal. The lead MH-60 Sierra lifted off the deck, its nose dipping forward as it transitioned into horizontal flight, clearing the edge of the carrier by less than 50 feet before disappearing into the blackness. The second helicopter followed 30 seconds later. They were flying low, less than 100 feet above the water, to minimize their radar cross-section as they approached the Iranian coastline. Their navigation lights were off, their silhouettes invisible against the starless sky. Higher above, at 22,000 feet, the protective umbrella was already forming. 4 F-35 Bravo Lightning fighters from the Marine Corps were pushing ahead of the helicopters, their advanced sensor suites scanning the horizon for any signs of Iranian interceptors or surface-to-air missile activity. These 5th-generation stealth fighters were the silent sentinels of the operation, using their AN/APG-81 radars to map every vessel and aircraft within a 100-mile radius. Accompanying them was a single E-2 Charlie Hawkeye, the massive rotating radar dish on its back, providing the command and control link that tied the entire task force together. The transit toward the crash site would take approximately 45 minutes at the helicopter's maximum cruising speed of 140 knots. The distance was 85 miles from the carrier's current position. As the rescue aircraft crossed the invisible line into Best, the northern Gulf, the electronic warfare officer aboard the E-2 Charlie Hawkeye began to report a surge in Iranian radio traffic. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy was mobilizing its fast attack craft from the base at Qeshm Island. The race for the survivors of Havoc 11 had become a literal sprint between the world's most advanced rescue force and a swarm of high-speed littoral combatants. Inside the cabin of Rescue 1, the lead pararescue jumper looked out at the dark water through the open side door. The wind whipped past. At 80 miles per hour, the roar of the twin engines vibrating through his boots. He knew the stats. The survival rate for aircrew in 70-degree water dropped significantly after the first 2 hours, due to exhaustion and the onset of mild hypothermia. They were already at the 90-minute mark. He gripped the hoist handle, his mind rehearsing the transition from the hovering helicopter into the cold, oil-slicked water of the strait. the tactical situation was darkening. The E-2 Charlie Hawkeye detected 3 Iranian fast attack craft, moving at 45 knots, less than 15 miles from the northernmost emergency beacon. The American helicopters were still 25 miles out. The commander of the task force, watching the data link from the carrier's bridge, authorized the F-35 Bravo fighters to descend to 10,000 feet and prepare for a show of force, or more, if the Iranian vessels attempted to interfere with the recovery. The rules of engagement had been clarified. Any attempt by hostile forces to seize the sitem, downed crew would be met with immediate and decisive kinetic action. The helicopters banked to the northeast, following the digital breadcrumbs left by the digital said 5 emergency beacons. The invisible bridge of electronic signals was the only thing connecting the rescuers to the men in the water. As the distance closed to 10 miles, the pilots switched their radios to the survival frequency, hoping to hear the voice of a survivor over the static of the night. 3:05 in the morning, the northern reaches of the Strait of Hormuz, the 3 Iranian fast attack craft, part of the Revolutionary Guard's Coastal Defense Force, were cutting through the swells at 45 knots, their triple outboard engines screaming in the dark. They were less than 12 miles from the northernmost emergency beacon of the downed B-52. These vessels were small, agile, and heavily armed, with 20mm cannons and shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles. On the bridge of the lead boat, the commander stared into a tactical tablet that showed the same search and rescue satellite hits the Americans were tracking. For Tehran, the capture of 5 American strategic bomber crewmen would be a geopolitical victory of unimaginable scale. The sea in this sector was not empty. Hidden beneath the thermal layers of the strait, an Iranian Kilo-class submarine, the Tariq, moved at a silent 4 knots. The diesel-electric boat had been on a routine picket station when the shoot-down occurred. Its sonar operators had heard the catastrophic breakup of Havoc 11, the sound of 8 engines flaming out, the structural groans of a massive airframe shattering, and the heavy, distinctive impact of the fuselage hitting the water. Now, the Tariq was positioned as a silent underwater sentry, its passive sonar arrays listening for the high-frequency churn of American helicopter rotors, or the cavitation of approaching rescue vessels. The atmosphere on the surface was thick with the smell of diesel and the cold, metallic tang of the sea. The Iranian crews were disciplined and operating under strict radio silence. They knew the Americans were coming. It was only a matter of when and with what force. As the lead fast boat closed the distance to 10 miles, the commander ordered his gunners to man the forward mounts. The night was black, but their infrared optics began to pick up the faint, rhythmic blinking of a strobe light on the horizon, a survival signal from one of the Americans. High above, the E-2 Charlie Hawkeye detected the Iranian movement and immediately relayed the data to the F-35 Bravo fighters. The tactical situation was rapidly deteriorating into a direct collision. The American pilots, orbiting at 10,000 feet, could see the white wakes of the Iranian boats on their synthetic aperture radars. The distance between the Iranian interceptors and the first American survivor was now less than 8 minutes. The American task force commander, aboard the USS Abraham Lincoln, faced a critical decision: allow the Iranians to reach the survivors first, or authorize a kinetic intervention that would escalate the engagement into a localized naval war. Under the surface, the Tariq's sonar officer detected a new sound: the rapid, high-pitched whine of the MH-60 Sierra helicopters approaching from the south. The submarine commander ordered the boat to periscope depth. He intended to use his mast-mounted sensors to provide target data to the fast boats, or, if necessary, to engage any American surface ships that might try to enter the area. The Kilo-class submarine carried a payload of 18 torpedoes and was a lethal threat to any destroyer or littoral combat ship that might venture too close to the Iranian coast. The Iranian fast boats were now 5 miles from the first beacon. The strobe light was clearly visible to the naked eye, a tiny, desperate pulse of white in a world of shadows. The American helicopters, Rescue 1 and Rescue 2, were still 6 minutes out, their pilots pushing the airframes to their absolute limits. The rotor blades bit into the salt-heavy air, the vibrations shaking the teeth of the pararescue jumpers in the back. They could see the Iranian wakes, now 3 white lines on the black water, closing fast from the northeast. The air over the strait crackled with electronic tension. The F-35 Bravo lead pilot toggled his radio to the secure fleet frequency. He reported that the Iranian vessels were ignoring all international hailing frequencies and were within 3 miles of the first survivor. He requested permission to execute a low-altitude buzz as a final warning, followed by a weapons-free authorization if the boats continued their approach. The reply from the command center was immediate. Authorization granted. Protect the crew at all costs. The F-35 Bravos rolled into a steep dive, their Pratt & Whitney phone 135 engines roaring as they broke the sound barrier just above the waves. The sonic boom slammed into the Iranian boats like a physical blow, shattering the spray from their bows. It was the final warning. The rescue of Havoc 11 was no longer a mission of mercy. It was a battle for the survivors, and the first shots were only seconds away. 3:12 in the morning, 10 miles off the Iranian coast. The tension that had been building since the loss of Havoc 11 finally snapped. The F-35 Bravo lead, callsign Reaper 1, watched his tactical display as the 3 Iranian fast attack craft ignored the sonic boom and continued their high-speed run toward the first strobe light. Simultaneously, the E-2 Charlie Hawkeye detected 2 Iranian Phantom interceptors screaming off the runway at Bandar Abbas, climbing hard to intercept the American rescue force. The rules of engagement had been met. The order was relayed from the carrier. Reaper 1, you are weapons free. Clear the lane. The air was suddenly torn apart by the clinical efficiency of modern aerial warfare. Reaper 1 squeezed the trigger. Inside the internal weapons bay of the stealth fighter, a 1,000-pound GBU-32 Joint Direct Attack munition was released, followed a second later by a laser-guided Hellfire missile from the second F-35. The weapons fell into the dark, their seeker heads locking onto the thermal signatures of the high-speed boat engines. The Hellfire missile shrieked off the rail, a white column of fire punching backward through the smoke and illuminating the underside of the F-35 for a fraction of a second. The heat blast washed across the fuselage as the missile accelerated to Mach 1.3, its solid rocket motor leaving a needle-thin trail of white exhaust against the black sky. Below, the Iranian boat commander had no time to maneuver. The missile was traveling too fast for the human eye to track. The warhead punched straight through the fiberglass hull of the lead Iranian fast boat, detonating in the engine compartment with a violent, orange eruption. The boat was instantly vaporized, its structural integrity failing as 200 pounds of high explosives shattered the frame into 1,000 jagged fragments. A fireball, 200 feet wide, bleached the sky, sending burning debris and fuel raining down into the sea for hundreds of yards in every direction. The secondary explosion of the boat's own ammunition locker sent a shockwave across the water that rattled the windows of the remaining vessels. The 2 surviving Iranian boats veered sharply in opposite directions, their pilots kicking the rudders hard as they attempted to escape the kill zone. One boat began firing its 20mm cannon wildly into the sky, the red tracer rounds arching harmlessly into the darkness in a desperate display of defiance. The Iranian 4 Phantoms, seeing their surface support destroyed, banked into a high G turn, their radar warning receivers screaming as the F-35 Bravos transitioned to an air-to-air intercept. The Phantoms dove for the deck, jettisoning their external fuel tanks to gain speed as they fled, back toward the protection of their coastal missile batteries. Black smoke rose from the oil fire, still burning on the surface where the lead boat had been. The sea was littered with hissing fragments of metal and carbon fiber, the only remains of the interceptor. The 2 remaining Iranian boats had broken contact, fleeing toward the north at 50 knots, their mission of capture abandoned in the face of overwhelming American fire. The airspace over the first survivor was now clear, but the silence that followed was heavy with the smell of burnt powder and the chemical bite of scorched seawater. While the fighters pushed the Iranian air threat back toward the coast, the EA-18 Gulf Growlers began their specialized work. These electronic attack aircraft flooded the Iranian radar network with a wall of white noise. On the ground, the HQ-9 battery operators saw their screens dissolve into a flickering mess of false targets and static. The jamming blanket was so intense that even the Iranian shore-to-ship radios began to fail, cutting off the fast boats from their command centers. This electronic dominance was the shield under which the rescue helicopters would now operate. Rescue 1 and Rescue 2 were now only 3 miles from the first beacon. The pilots could see the smoke from the destroyed boat, drifting across their night vision displays. The water below was a churned-up mess of white foam and dark swells. The lead helicopter flared, its nose pitching up to bleed off airspeed as it transitioned into a 50-foot hover directly over a tiny, bobbing figure in a yellow life vest. The downwash from the rotors flattened the sea into a circular pattern of spray, the salt-heavy air becoming a mist that coated the cockpit glass. The pararescue jumpers moved with practiced, mechanical speed. The side door was thrown open, and the hoist operator leaned out into the wind, his eyes locked on the survivor. "Target in sight!" he shouted over the intercom. The lead jumper, already hooked to the cable, gave a thumbs up and stepped out into the void. He descended into the dark, the roar of the engines and the heat of the exhaust swirling around him as he prepared to pull the first of the 5 missing men from the reach of the strait. 3:45 in the morning, 25,000 feet over the central Persian Gulf. While the kinetic engagement unfolded 10,000 feet below, the survival of the rescue operation now rested on a massive, invisible bridge of logistics. 3 KC-135 Stratotankers, flying in a racetrack pattern known as a refueling anchor, were the lifeblood of the mission. Without them, the F-35 Bravo fighters and the EA-18 Golf Growlers would have been forced to return to the USS Abraham Lincoln within the hour, leaving the rescue helicopters defenseless against a second wave of Iranian interceptors. Each tanker carried over 150,000 pounds of fuel, a flying reservoir that turned a short-duration scramble into a sustained strategic operation. The coordination was managed with surgical precision by the E-2 Charlie Hawkeye. The mission commander inside the Hawkeye watched a digital tapestry of 60 different aircraft, each with its own fuel state and mission priority. The logistics were a constant, high-stakes calculation. An F-35 Bravo in full afterburner, maneuvering to engage a surface threat, can consume fuel at a rate of nearly 80,000 pounds per hour. To keep 4 of these fighters on station, the tankers had to cycle them through the refueling lines every 40 minutes, a process that required the pilots to fly within 20 feet of each other at 500 miles per hour in total darkness. The physical reality of the refueling was grueling. A Marine pilot, his eyes strained by 4 hours of night vision use, would maneuver his fighter behind the tanker, his infrared sensors locking onto the faint glow of the refueling boom. The boom operator, lying prone in the tail of the KC-135, used a joystick to guide the heavy steel nozzle into the fighter's receptacle. One miscalculation in the turbulent night air could result in a mid-air collision or a severed fuel line, potentially ending the mission in a second catastrophe. Between 3:45 and 4:15 in the morning, the 3 tankers transferred a combined total of 280,000 pounds of jet fuel, ensuring that the shield of steel over the rescue site remained unbroken. On the flight deck of the USS Abraham Lincoln, the logistics of the surge were equally intense. Ordnance teams, their jerseys color-coded in red, were already preparing a second wave of missiles for the next rotation of aircraft. They moved with practiced efficiency, hauling 2,000-pound munitions across the deck on hydraulic carts. The air was a cacophony of screaming jet engines, the clatter of tie-down chains, and the constant hiss of the steam catapults. The ship's engineers monitored the consumption of 50,000 gallons of fresh water used every hour for the steam systems, while the hangar deck crews worked to repair a minor hydraulic leak on a reserve helicopter. Medical logistics were also in high gear. In the carrier's primary flight deck triage center, a team of 20 surgeons, nurses, and corpsmen stood ready. They had prepared 5 trauma bays, each equipped with advanced life support systems, blood units, and thermal blankets to combat the hypothermia they expected the survivors to be suffering from. The ship's blood bank had been cross-matched for the specific types of the 5 missing crew members, a detail coordinated with the personnel office hours before the first helicopter even reached the crash site. The E-2 Charlie Hawkeye also managed the communications logistics, acting as a massive signal relay. Because of the intense Iranian jamming, the rescue helicopters could not communicate directly with the carrier or the command center in Qatar. The Hawkeye utilized its high-gain satellite links and encrypted data burst technology to bridge the gap, translating the short-range tactical radio calls from the pararescue jumpers into a clear, real-time data feed for the admirals watching hundreds of miles away. This ensured that every decision-maker had the same picture of the battlefield, from the temperature of the water to the exact location of the Iranian fast boats. The rescue was a machine with 10,000 moving parts, and at 4:20 in the morning, every part was holding. The first survivor had been pulled into the cabin of Rescue 1, and the second was being hoisted into the air. The fuel was flowing, the sensors were clear, and the perimeter was secure. But the Iranian HQ-9 battery, the very weapon that had started the night's violence, was still active on the coast, and the American command was not about to let it remain a threat. 4:25 in the morning, 5 miles off the Iranian coast. The extraction of the Havoc 11 crew was entering its most perilous phase. The rescue helicopters, Rescue 1 and Rescue 2, were now hovering over the primary cluster of beacons, their rotors kicking up a blinding mist of salt spray that threatened to overwhelm their engines. The environment was a nightmare of sensory overload. The air was thick with the smell of burning oil from the destroyed Iranian boat, mixed with the sharp, chemical tang of the green phosphorescent dye markers the airmen had deployed to mark their positions. Electronic interference from the Iranian mainland had intensified to a deafening level. The HQ-9 battery was no longer just searching for targets. It was flooding the rescue frequencies with high-intensity burst jamming. Inside the cockpit of Rescue 1, the pilot's primary flight displays flickered and rolled, the digital altitude tapes jumping erratically as the sensors struggled to filter out the false signals. He had to rely on his co-pilot's physical eyeball on the horizon and the steady, calm voice of the hoist operator to maintain a stable hover just 50 feet above the heaving swells. The second survivor, the bomber's co-pilot, was being winched up in a rescue basket. He was visible in the green glow of the night vision optics, a dark, slumped figure shivering violently from the onset of hypothermia. As the basket cleared the water, the Iranian coastal batteries attempted one last act of desperation. A shoulder-fired surface-to-air missile, a man-portable system, was launched from a hidden position on a nearby rocky outcropping. The heat seeker streaked toward the hovering helicopter. Its white exhaust trailed a jagged line against the black sky. The MH-60 Sierra's automated defense system reacted in milliseconds. A cloud of magnesium flares erupted from the helicopter's sides, burning at 2,000 degrees to lure the missile away. The missile bit on the decoy, detonating 30 meters behind the tail rotor in a brilliant flash that momentarily blinded the crew. The pilot didn't flinch. He held the hover until the co-pilot was safely hauled inside the cabin. 2 on board, 3 to go. The hoist operator screamed over the internal comms. The third and fourth survivors were located 200 yards to the east, their life vests tangled together in a patch of floating debris. Rescue 2 moved in to assist. To speed up the recovery, these specialists worked with brutal efficiency, slicing through parachute shrouds with serrated knives and securing the exhausted airmen into harnesses. The water was a chaotic churn of white foam, the downwash from 2 helicopters, creating a localized hurricane that made communication nearly impossible. The 5th survivor, the bomber's pilot, was the furthest away. His beacon was faint, and he was not responding to radio hails. Rescue 1 broke hover and raced toward his last known coordinates, the pilot pushing the engines into the yellow on the torque meters. They found him drifting near a large piece of the B-52's wing section. He was conscious, but badly injured, his flight suit torn, and his left arm held at an unnatural angle. The pararescue jumper was in the water, beside him in seconds, stabilizing his neck and preparing him for a high-speed hoist. As the final survivor was being lifted, the electronic warfare officer on the E-2 Charlie Hawkeye reported a new threat. The Iranian HQ-9 battery had stopped jamming and was once again emitting a high-powered targeting signal. They were locking onto the rescue helicopters. The window of opportunity was closing. The carrier task force commander issued the final authorization. The recovery was almost complete, but the exit path had to be cleared with fire. The 5 survivors were now inside the helicopters, wrapped in thermal blankets and receiving immediate tactical medical care. The pararescue jumpers were performing rapid trauma assessments, checking for internal bleeding and the effects of the high-altitude ejection. The pilots banked their aircraft hard to the south, diving back toward the safety of the open Gulf. Behind them, the Iranian coast was beginning to glow, with the first faint light of pre-dawn, and the American strike fighters were rolling in to ensure the HQ-9 battery would never fire another shot. 4:48 in the morning. The coastal cliffs north of Bandar Abbas. The Iranian HQ-9 battery had committed a fatal error. It had stayed in its firing position too long while attempting to jam the rescue helicopters. Now, the American response was already in flight. 2 EA-18 Gulf Growlers, orbiting 15 miles offshore, had localized the battery's radar emissions with pinpoint accuracy. The mission was no longer about rescue. It was about the systematic destruction of the threat that had claimed Havoc 11. The command was given from the carrier strike center: suppress and destroy. The air over the Strait of Hormuz was suddenly filled with the roar of incoming ordnance. From the Mark 41 vertical launch system of the destroyer DDG-51, USS Arleigh Burke, 4 Tomahawk cruise missiles breached the surface of the water, their solid rocket boosters pushing them into a low-altitude transition. Simultaneously, the Growlers released 4 AGM-88 HARM missiles. These high-speed anti-radiation missiles were designed for a single purpose: to fly down the throat of an active radar beam. The first HARM missile shrieked off the wing pylon of the Growler, a white column of fire punching backward through the humidity-heavy air and illuminating the cockpit for 3 full seconds. The missile accelerated instantly to Mach 2. Its seeker head locked onto the electronic pulse of the HQ-9's targeting radar. On the ground, the Iranian operators saw the warning on their screens, but the weapon was traveling too fast to allow for a relocation. The missile's rocket motor left a searing white needle line across the sky that pointed directly at the battery's heart. The warhead punched straight through the center of the radar van, the 200 pounds of high explosives detonating inside the sensitive electronic suite. The van erupted instantly, its metal skin peeling back like a discarded ration tin as a fireball bleached the surrounding rocks white. The radar dish was blasted off its mount, sent flying 50 meters into the air before it crashed back into the burning wreckage. The secondary explosion of the cooling systems sent a wave of blue-green electrical fire surging through the battery's power lines, plunging the entire site into chaos. 10 seconds later, the 4 Tomahawk cruise missiles arrived. They didn't come from above, but from the side, hugging the terrain at 50 feet, before popping up for their terminal dive. The first Tomahawk drove into the lead missile transporter, its half-ton warhead crushing the steel frame before detonating. The 3 remaining HQ-9 interceptors on the truck exploded in a catastrophic chain reaction. A pillar of white and orange fire rose 400 feet into the air, the shockwave shattering every window in a nearby coastal village, and throwing the battery's support vehicles onto their sides. The 4th Tomahawk slammed into the command and control bunker, its delayed action fuse allowing it to penetrate 3 meters of reinforced concrete before exploding. The Earth itself seemed to heave as the underground facility was ground apart by the pressure. Dust and debris were blown 100 meters out of the bunker's entrance, followed by a thick, rolling cloud of black smoke that blotted out the first light of the morning sun. The site was no longer a military installation. It was a graveyard of twisted metal and scorched earth. The HQ-9 battery was silenced. The electronic interference that had plagued the strait for the last hour vanished, replaced by a dead silence on the Iranian military frequencies. The Growlers maintained their orbit for another 5 minutes, their sensors searching for any signs of remaining activity. But the battery was cold. The threat to the rescue force had been obliterated with a level of violence that left no room for recovery. 30 miles to the south, the crews of Rescue 1 and Rescue 2 saw the flashes on the horizon. The shockwaves reached them as a distant, heavy thud that they felt in their chests more than they heard through their headsets. The path home was now clear. The helicopters turned their noses toward the south. Their engines settled into a steady, rhythmic throb as they put the Iranian coastline behind them. The mission had been a success, but the cost of the evening was still being tallied in the back of the helicopters, where 5 American airmen were finally being told they were safe. 5:15 in the morning. The open waters of the central Persian Gulf. The 2 MH-60 Sierra helicopters were flying at a tactical altitude of 50 feet, their rotors blurring against a sky that was transitioning from deep indigo to a pale, bruised violet. Inside the cramped, vibrating cabins, the atmosphere was a mix of intense medical focus and the sudden, heavy exhaustion that follows a life-or-death struggle. The 5 survivors of Havoc 11 were no longer names on a manifest or blinking icons on a radar screen. They were 5 battered men, shivering under layers of silver mylar blankets, their faces pale and streaked with dried salt and engine oil. The medical evacuation protocol was being executed with the same mechanical precision as the strike that had preceded it. The pararescue jumpers, known as PJs, were the primary caregivers. In the back of Rescue 1, the senior PJ had his fingers pressed against the carotid artery of the bomber's pilot. He was checking the man's pulse against the rhythmic thumping of the airframe. The pilot's left arm had been stabilized in a vacuum splint, and an intravenous line was already feeding warm saline into his system to combat the 68-degree water's effect on his core temperature. The air in the cabin smelled of antiseptic, wet flight, suits, and the metallic tang of blood. The transit back to the carrier strike group was a high-speed dash. The pilots had the throttles pushed to the edge of the structural limit, the twin engines screaming as they consumed fuel at an accelerated rate. To the north, the Iranian coast was a jagged black line falling away into the distance. To the south, the USS Abraham Lincoln was still 40 miles away, but its presence was felt through the constant, reassuring voices of the air traffic controllers on the encrypted net. Every few minutes, a pair of F-35 Bravo fighters would roar past 1,000 feet above, their twin engines providing a thunderous acoustic shield for the vulnerable helicopters. Communications remained disciplined and sparse. The PJs used short-range radios to relay vitals to the carrier's medical team. Rescue 1 to Lincoln. Medical. We have 3 souls on board. Patient Alpha has a suspected compound fracture of the humerus and stage 2 hypothermia. Patients Bravo and Charlie are stable but suffering from exhaustion and minor lacerations. Estimated time of arrival is 15 minutes. The response from the ship was immediate and calm, confirming that the trauma teams were on deck and the flight deck was cleared for a straight-in approach. The logistics of the return flight were a delicate balance of physics and physiology. At 140 knots, the wind buffeting the open side doors of the helicopters was a constant roar. The crew chiefs had to secure every piece of medical equipment, from oxygen tanks to cardiac monitors, to ensure nothing was shifted by the violent vibrations. The survivors were strapped into the floor-mounted litters, their eyes mostly closed, some drifting in and out of consciousness as the adrenaline of the ejection and the terror of the water finally began to fade. On the horizon, the silhouette of the USS Abraham Lincoln began to take shape, a massive gray island of steel and light rising out of the morning haze. The ship was still steaming at 30 knots, creating its own wind to assist the landing. As the helicopters approached, the pilots could see the LSO, or landing signal officer, standing on his platform, his glow sticks waving them into the landing pattern. The flight deck was a beehive of activity, but the area around the island had been kept clear for the incoming casualties. The transition from the vibrating chaos of the helicopter to the stable deck of the carrier was a blur of motion. As the wheels of Rescue 1 touched down on the non-skid surface, the side doors were flung open. Teams of corpsmen in green jerseys surged forward with wheeled stretchers. They didn't wait for the rotors to stop spinning. They moved under the wash of the blades, ducking low against the wind. In less than 90 seconds, all 5 survivors had been moved from the aircraft to the elevators, disappearing into the belly of the ship. Toward the primary flight deck triage center, the helicopters remained on the deck, their engines finally spooling down into a low, mournful whine. The pilots sat in their seats for a long moment, hands resting on the controls, their flight suits soaked with sweat. They had flown over 200 miles into a denied environment, witnessed the destruction of an enemy fleet and a missile battery, and brought 5 of their own back from the edge of the grave. The sun was now fully above the horizon, casting a long, golden light across the deck of the carrier. But the mission was not truly over until the final debrief. 6 in the morning, the bridge of the USS Abraham Lincoln. The sun had fully cleared the horizon, turning the Persian Gulf into a vast sheet of hammered gold. On the bridge, the admiral of Carrier Strike Group 11 stood by the forward windows, his silhouette reflected against the thick, bullet-resistant glass. Below him, the flight deck was beginning to return to its standard operational tempo, though the charred footprints of the night's rescue mission remained. The 5 crew members of Havoc 11 were now in the ship's medical ward. 3 were in stable condition. 1 was in surgery for a shattered humerus, and the navigator was being treated for severe internal bruising. They were alive, but the world they had woken up to was fundamentally altered. The strategic cost of the night was staggering. A B-52 Stratofortress, a primary pillar of the United States nuclear triad and conventional deterrence, lay in pieces at the bottom of the Strait of Hormuz. In exchange, an Iranian HQ-9 battery had been reduced to a smoldering crater, and 3 Iranian fast attack craft had been sent to the sea floor. The official report from the Combined Air Operations Center in Qatar was already being drafted for the White House. It would describe the event not as a skirmish, but as a significant escalation in regional hostilities that had tested the limits of American power projection. The regional deterrence posture had shifted from monitored peace to active defense. Within 4 hours of the rescue, 2 additional squadrons of F-22 Raptors were ordered to deploy from the continental United States to Al Udeid Air Base. The USS Abraham Lincoln received orders to move to a holding station 100 miles south of the strait, maintaining a continuous combat air patrol over the shipping lanes. The message from Washington was clear. The United States would not retreat from the Gulf, but every flight would now be escorted by a full package of electronic warfare and stealth assets. The logistical cleanup was a quiet, somber affair. On the flight deck, the 2 MH-60 Sierra helicopters that had performed the rescue were being moved into the hangar bay for deep maintenance. Their engines had ingested a significant amount of salt and sand during the low-altitude hovers, and the airframes showed the stress of flying. At the absolute edge of their performance envelopes, technicians in brown jerseys crawled over the rotors, checking for microfractures in the composite blades. The pararescue jumpers had already cleaned their gear, their blood-stained medical kits restocked and ready for the next call that they hoped would never come. In the ship's wardroom, the mood was one of grim professional satisfaction. The mission had been a tactical success. The recovery of 5 downed airmen in a denied environment was a feat that few militaries on Earth could replicate. However, the loss of Havoc 11 was a reminder of the increasing lethality of modern integrated air defense systems. The Clancy realism of the situation was not lost on the officers. They knew that the next engagement might not end with a 5-for-5 recovery. The Iranian military had shown it was willing to fire on strategic assets, and the threshold for total war had never been thinner. The final assessment of Operation Crimson Vigil was logged at 6:45 in the morning. The search and rescue phase was officially terminated. The 5 survivors were scheduled for medical transport to Landstuhl, Germany, as soon as they were stabilized. As the Admiral watched a pair of FA-18 Gulf Growlers launch for the morning patrol, he knew the silence over the strait was temporary. The debris of the bomber would eventually settle into the silt of the seafloor, but the shockwaves of its destruction would be felt in every capital from Washington to Tehran for years to come. This was not the end of the conflict. It was merely the end of the first chapter. The Gulf remained a place of heat, salt, and the ever-present smell of jet fuel, a place where the line between a routine patrol and a global crisis was measured in the seconds it took for a radar to lock onto a target.